Proposal number 3 is proportional voting. This should also be one of the most popular proposals for the same reasons ordered choice voting should be widely accepted. Proportional voting takes ordered choice voting to the next level for legislative elections to further improve voter representation. We will start by looking at a conventional first-past-the-post vote as we did in the video for Proposal 2. Here Alice wins an election with 40% of the vote despite the fact that 60% of the people prefer Party B. This was the central problem that we addressed with ordered choice voting. So, with ordered choice voting we correctly elect Dirk to the position since he beats all 4 candidates in head-to-head races. But if you elect either Dirk or Alice, either candidate will only represent a minority of the total first-choice votes. While 40% prefer Alice, 60% prefer someone else. And similarly, while 20% prefer Dirk, 80% would rather have someone else in office. Since you can only select one person to be president, there is not much you can do about this. The majority will always get someone who is not their first choice. However, with a legislative position, we can do much better than this since it is a representative body. Let's say you have a legislature like the United States House of Representatives with 435 members. Each legislator has one vote for a total of 435 votes. With proportional representation we will give each legislative district 100 votes. This can be distributed amongst multiple legislators in that district. Thus, the total number of votes on any legislation is now 43,500. Now for proportional voting, we take the first choice from each person and examine what percentage that is of the total. Alice gets 40% of the vote while Bob, Charles, and Dirk each get 20% of the vote. Instead of giving Alice 100% of the votes like we do with the current system, we will give Alice 40% of the total votes, equal to her total vote share. 40% times 100 votes gives her 40 votes in the legislature. Bob, Charles, and Dirk each get 20% of the votes, or 20 votes each. The system will also allow fractional votes. For example, 1/3 of the vote will give you 33.33 votes. From a practical standpoint, we set a minimum threshold a person must get to receive a seat. Otherwise you could have a lot of legislators with only 1% of the votes. A threshold of between 3% and 10% depending on the legislative body would be reasonable. Since Elliot gets no votes, he is obviously below the threshold and gets no seats. Another way you can set the threshold is by letting candidates set their own vote threshold. This works by assigning a fixed salary available to an entire district. The candidate then receives pay based on the percent of votes they receive in the election. For example, if $500,000 is the salary allocated to a district, then someone who receives 20% of the vote gets a $100,000 salary. Someone with 40% of the vote gets a salary of $200,000, while someone with 3% of the vote will get only $15,000. That person with 3% of the vote might decide that $15,000 is not enough money to compensate him or her for time spent representing the people. For others, they might be willing to do so as a public service. In this manner candidates could pre-specify what threshold they believe is meaningful. For some people it could be 10%, for others it could be 2%. This system also provides a positive incentive to satisfy their constituents. The more votes they get, the more money they make and the more influence they have in the legislature. Now if you have fixed resources for your legislature, you can outnumber the districts for accommodating the additional representatives from each district. For example, in the US they could divide the current 435 by 5 to come up with 87 new districts. The $174,000 salary per representative can now be multiplied by 5 to give a total district salary of $870,000. Then a candidate with 20% of the vote will receive the same salary as a current House member. That goes up or down with the share of the votes. As we are about to discuss, with proportional voting resizing a district like this becomes a very trivial issue because there are no issues such as gerrymandering to consider. Gerrymandering is the practice of drawing a voting district to benefit one party over another. This strategy only works because of the winner-take-all nature of elections right now. For example, let's say you have 3 voting districts that have 300,000 people between them with 150,000 voting Liberal and 150,000 voting Conservative. In the middle of the district is a city with 100,000 people that vote 90% Liberal. That is 90,000 Liberals and 10,000 Conservatives. That means outside that city in this same area, you have 60,000 Liberals and 140,000 Conservatives. Given these dramatic geographic differences between urban and suburban voters, how you draw up the voting district makes a big difference in congressional representation. Let's say we put one big round district around the city with 100,000 people and then divide the remaining area equally into 2 parts. We will then have one district that votes overwhelmingly Liberal by 90% and 2 districts that vote overwhelmingly Conservative at 70%. So, there will be 2 conservatives and 1 liberal in Congress nearly every election, even though there are equal numbers of conservatives and liberals in the 3 districts taken as a whole. However, if you cut up the 3 districts into 3 equally sized pie pieces, every district will basically have equivalent numbers of conservatives and liberals, just like the entire area as a whole. In 1 year, 3 liberals could win, or 3 conservatives could win, depending on the fluctuations of the population. This pattern of representation much better reflects how these 3 districts should be treated as a whole. It is thus to the advantage of conservatives to draw the boundaries with the city walled off from the other districts, so they are assured of a 2-to-1 seat advantage in every single Congress. With proportional voting, gerrymandering does not gain the conservatives anything even if they draw the map to their advantage. This is because the liberal representatives in the central district will have more political power relative to the conservatives in the other 2 districts because of their stronger 90% majority. The liberals in the city will have 90 votes in the Congress to 10 votes for the conservative side. For each of the other 2 districts you will have 70 votes for conservatives and 30 votes for liberals. That all adds up to 150 seats for conservatives and 150 seats for liberals on average. No matter how you redraw the map, the voting proportions in Congress will accurately reflect the composition of the people in these regions. This is how fair-minded society should want the vote tabulated. The other great thing about proportional voting is that it will encourage many more voices in Congress. In our hypothetical example, only Alice in a first-past-the-post election, or Dirk in an ordered choice election, would represent the district in Congress. Under this system, Dirk, Alice, Charles, and Bob will all have voices, each bringing unique perspectives better reflecting the people that voted for them. This will encourage more than the 2 philosophical viewpoints of the main 2 parties. We will get more diverse opinions in Congress. You will tend to get less of one side dominating the debate. People will have to form coalitions with other factions to get legislation passed. Divisive politicians will suffer if their entire strategy is blaming the other team, because they then will likely find it difficult to find a coalition to support legislation they want to pass. It also becomes easier to hold a rogue president accountable under impeachment, because that person will likely only have a minority support in Congress. The rest can view the trial much more objectively. Please note that a lot of people point to Europe complaining multiple parties in the legislature is a disaster. But that is solely due to the inherently flawed nature of the parliamentary system. It is the need to form a government and these on-again, off-again alliances between reluctant partners that causes such instability. If these nations directly elected the executive branch leaders, this would not be a problem. The parliamentary system should go the way of the dinosaur and become extinct along with the 2-party dominance of political systems around the world. Now let's discuss how to deal with candidates who do not make the vote threshold to get elected to a position in the legislature. This can be a hard threshold like 3% to 10%, or it can be a candidate-determined threshold based on the amount of salary they are willing to work for, or a combination of the 2. Candidates who make the threshold based on the number 1 position on the ballot, obviously will get elected. What happens to the other candidates? Let's take an abnormally high threshold of 21% to give you an example of how we can handle it. In this example, only Alice gets above 21%. Now obviously just sending Alice to Congress is not what we want, especially when we know Dirk wins an ordered choice vote. As with ordered choice voting, every person's vote should count even if their initial candidate did not win based solely on the number 1 position. In this graphic, you see the people who voted for Alice in green. They already have representation that made it through the first round. Now we will look at those that did not, persons 2, 4, and 5, and how to most fairly enfranchise them. It is also obvious if you remove just 1 candidate in the fashion of instant runoff voting, then Dirk, Charles, or Bob each have a pretty good chance of making the vote threshold, since they all are just short at 20% support. Since they are all tied, it seems kind of arbitrary who to throw out. But as we know from ordered choice voting, it is not arbitrary. We know Dirk is the most popular candidate of all. So, you might expect that he should not be the one removed. Well, let's look more closely at that assumption. So, what we are going to do is look only at the voters who did not have someone placed at number 1 meeting their threshold on the first round. Again, these are the voters in blue. Everyone else, in this case those that voted for Alice, have someone they like in the legislature. So, we will ignore what they think for deciding these other spots to represent the remainder of voters. What we do now is run an ordered choice vote among the voters who did not have their top choice make the threshold. Only candidates who did not make the threshold are included because we are looking to figure out who to drop. We will then drop the person at the bottom of this list, since they are clearly the least liked among the people that still need representation in the legislature. So now we have 4 candidates, which means we need to make 4 times 3 equals 12, which is then divided by 2 to give us a total of 6 comparisons. These comparisons are shown at the bottom of this slide. So, we have to make 6 comparisons, just among 3 voters this time. So, we start with Bob versus Charles, crossing out persons 1 and 3 that voted for Alice, who is ensured of making the first round. We then look at only Bob and Charles. It is pretty clear Charles wins 2 votes to 1. We go through all 6 races to see who gets the most victories. Then we add up the number of victories for each person as before. What we find is Charles is number 1 with 3 victories over everyone else, Dirk is number 2 with 2 victories, Elliot is number 3 with 1 victory, and Bob is number 4 with 0 victories. Notice among these 3 voters, Charles and not Dirk is the most popular. That is because Dirk tended to do better amongst Alice's voters. This is the reason you have to go back and check each of these races rather than just assuming Dirk would be most popular among the remaining candidates. What is clear here is Bob is the least liked candidate of the remaining voters. So, we strike Bob from the list and look to see who makes the threshold now. Now we look at the list again, crossing out Bob from the number 1 spot. Charles has moved up to the first position with person 5, so he now gets 40% along with Alice. That leaves only person number 2 unrepresented. Now we repeat the procedure of only looking at the people that need to be represented and who they prefer. Since it is only one person, we only need to go down the list. Since there is only 1 spot left, none of the candidates that did not make the cut, Dirk and Elliot, will get over 21%. We simply need to pick who is higher, Charles or Alice. It is clear it is Alice. So the final proportional representation that best reflects the voters is Alice at 60% and Charles at 40%. Notice Dirk does not get any votes in the legislature even though he is the winner in an ordered choice vote. This makes sense. Dirk was a compromise candidate. He did better among Alice voters than Charles, who you can assume was more extreme. Both Alice voters had Charles dead last. Person 2 basically liked Dirk, but was not willing to vote for Charles, and picked Alice over him. This would be the moderate of Party B that swung the entire election for Dirk, and that is appropriate if you are only electing one candidate. With proportional representation, no one needs to make this compromise. In fact, in this example every single person got either their first or second choice despite an absurdly high threshold. 40% of the hardcore Party A people can be represented by Alice, and the 40% of the hardcore Party B people can be represented by Charles, and the 20% represented by the moderate swing voter person 2 goes for Alice. In reality, 21% was too high of a threshold and person 2 should have been represented by Dirk to better reflect our moderate views. But this was done for illustration purposes to show you exactly how you deal with the threshold in a proportional vote to best get the count to reflect the ideological makeup of the underlying voters.